Leslie Wells here. Let's talk about triggers and what triggers the different attachment styles, the insecure attachment styles. So, remembering that we are all wired for connection and that our very early childhood experiences and the bonds with our caregivers shape our experiences. They follow us into adulthood and they impact our relationships, especially our romantic relationships. They affect how we give and receive love if we're emotionally attuned, if we're emotionally available, and they show up in how we respond to conflict, commitment, intimacy, closeness, and communication. These early childhood experiences become very ingrained into our subconscious mind and our automatic programming. So these things are always operating behind the scenes, even though we are not consciously aware of them. These experiences that sometimes have assumptions, beliefs, different traumas, feelings tied to them or surrounding them can actually cause triggers that we are completely unaware of. At any time, they can be triggered and we have no idea, but it takes us back to experiences that happened then that have subconsciously stuck with us and are part of our automatic programming. So let's talk about what triggers the anxious preoccupied. So distance, physical and emotional distance, is something that will very much trigger the anxious preoccupied. Remember, they get most of their value and worth in relationships, and they're always afraid of being rejected or abandonment. So physical distance does not feel good to them, neither does emotional distance or lack of communication. Changes in body language, communication, patterns, behavior, tone, all of those things can trigger the anxious preoccupied who is always sort of waiting for you to walk out the door or reject them in some way. So that is something that will trigger them. And remember, because of these things, they are very hypervigilant and very attuned to any subtle changes in their partner. Conflict is a trigger for them as well because they're always afraid that if the conflict doesn't go well, or conflict is basically a threat or a possibility of the relationship ending. Another thing that triggers them is a lack of definition of relationship status, not knowing where they stand. Anxious preoccupieds really need to feel safe, secure, know that you're going to be there, that the relationship is solid, that it's stable. Those are things that they very much need. The dismissive avoidant, things that will trigger them: too little space. If they do not have enough space or autonomy or independence, that is something that will trigger them, and they will start to use deactivating or distancing strategies. Putting them in situations where they are pressured to be vulnerable and talk openly about their feelings does not feel good to them. Or you being overly vulnerable and oversharing and bringing them your big feelings. If you are extremely emotionally reactive and all of your big feelings are out there on display, they're going to be very uncomfortable. Conflict is another thing that will trigger the dismissive avoidant. They do not like conflict. They do not want to deal with it. It requires them to show up and be vulnerable and participate and be engaged in a way that does not feel good to them. They do not want to share what's going on inside because they do feel defective and they feel like they're not good enough. Intimacy and closeness and commitment are all things that will trigger the dismissive avoidant. If they feel like you're moving too fast, having too high expectations, asking for too big of a commitment, or if you're just getting emotionally intimate with them, that is something that will not feel good to them. Criticism is another thing that will create deactivating strategies for the dismissive avoidant and sometimes even lead to a trauma response. If you come at them with a need or a complaint, they already feel like they're going to disappoint you, that they're a failure, they're not good enough. They have this big defectiveness wound, and so criticism is something that will very quickly trigger them. Perceived clinginess or neediness is something that will oftentimes trigger a dismissive avoidant. And any pressure to co-regulate. They really like their own space to deal with what's going on with them, and they sort of feel like your feelings are yours, mine are mine. You go off and deal with yours, I'll handle my own stuff, but I don't want to see yours, don't really want to see mine. And so co-regulation and the request for that or pressure to do that is something that will often trigger them into a deactivating strategy, and a lot of times, again, a trauma response. The fearful avoidant is much more complex with their triggers. They have more of a variety because remember, they have characteristics of both that are both avoidant and anxious. So they're all over the place. The big thing for them, their core wound, is a trust break or a betrayal wound. So any of those things, a trust break or a betrayal will definitely trigger them, as well being misunderstood. So even just with the trust, not showing up the way that you said, if your words and actions do not match and there's a misalignment, that will automatically create distrust and a lot of times will trigger them. If you claim that you have certain morals or values or beliefs and you don't live those out and there's a discongruency between what you say and how you live your life and what you do, that is a big trigger for the fearful avoidant. Too little intimacy and closeness is something that will trigger a fearful avoidant who leans anxious. Too much intimacy and closeness is something that can trigger a fearful avoidant who leans avoidant. If the fearful avoidant leans avoidant, too little space or autonomy or independence is something that could be a trigger. For an FA that actually leans anxious, having too much space is something that could be a trigger. Again, they can be hypervigilant, so changes in behavior, tone, patterns, routines, all of those things can also be a trigger. Feeling controlled or manipulated is something that can definitely trigger an FA. And if it's an FA who's leaning avoidant, that can actually send them into a state of rebellion. Lack of reassurance and validation could be something that triggers an FA that is leaning anxious. Criticism could be something that really will trigger either side. If it's the FA, they will feel justified in maybe a fight response when that's brought to their attention. If it's an FA who leans avoidant, that's going to make them shut down because of that inner defectiveness wound. But either way, criticism is something that the FA typically does not handle very well and is triggered by. So those are just some of the triggers and how they affect the different attachment styles. We can all work on our triggers. We can lessen the severity of them. We can keep them from escalating. We can actually intervene within the trigger cycle to make it where we're not showing up in those negative, unproductive ways. If you're interested in learning more and you want to work on your own triggers, reach out.